Cyberpunk, The Flame That Remains. Written and read by Ethan Taplin. Chapter 1. Sofie. Night City, 2075. Darkness folded in around her as the last light of cyberspace drained away. Ghostly fragments of code lingered in her vision before vanishing into the back of her mind. The monitors above her powered down one by one, leaving only the faint hum of her computer across the room. Sofie exhaled, steadying herself. She lay in a tub of lukewarm water, the last of the ice long since melted, steam rising from her skin. Her head throbbed with the heat of overworked neural implants. The ice was just one of a few safeguards that kept her cyberware from boiling her brain, but she always felt woozy surfacing after a dive into the net anyway. Her disconnect routine came first, checking vitals, running virus scans, and making sure every scrap of data had landed in its proper place. Only then did Sofie push herself up from the tub, water dripping into the rubber mat along its base. She wrapped a towel around herself and slipped into a pair of plastic slippers, shuffling groggily into the shower. Cold water shocked her awake, hissing over skin that still steamed from the heat of her implants. The chill did its job, cooling the ache in her spine and skull, clearing her head, and waking her up faster than any cup of coffee ever could. She made the coffee anyway. A packet poured into a chipped mug, mixed with tap water, and left to spin in the microwave. While it hummed, she collected the laundry scattered across the bed, the chair, the floor, and crammed it into the washing machine hidden behind a sliding wall panel. The dryer was stacked on top, and by the time she'd finished digging around in it for something to wear, the microwave chimed. Sofie padded back to the microwave, pulled the mug free, set it on the counter, and then turned back to the clothes she had selected and began to dress. Blue athletic shorts with pink trim, and a black tank top with a faded logo stretched across the chest. A pinned moth, wings splayed for all to see. The shirt had been a gift from her friend Ares. He'd grinned as he gave it to her, as if she should recognize the band. She hadn't. How could she? Her childhood had been too strict, too controlled. Even now she was still figuring out what she liked. But the shirt was soft and it reminded her of him, so that was enough. 2 years ago, when Sofie had first set foot in Night City, her first time in California, or the new United States at all for that matter, she had been nothing more than a fugitive with a suitcase full of trauma and the chrome under her skin. She'd crossed the ocean with little more than the clothes on her back and a few $1,000 given by a kind soul whose name she had never learned. It had been enough to rent a shoebox apartment and buy herself a little time before the past caught up. Now she lived under the protection of the Wirehounds, a booster gang that had made its home in Mega Building H5. Like the others scattered across Night City, the tower was less an apartment complex than a vertical city crammed into concrete and steel. 100 floors of stacked lives surrounding the atrium hollowed out from the center, every 10th layer jammed with shops and other services that kept the whole machine grinding on. Most residents could go weeks without stepping outside its walls. Some never did. For Sofie, H5 meant anonymity, safety of a kind. In a building with thousands of tenants, she could disappear into the press of the crowd, another face in the hive. It wasn't freedom, but it was cover, and cover was what she needed now. The screens above her desk blinked to life the moment she sat down, her neuroport and cyberdeck allowing her to ping the room's systems with a command as simple as thought. Monitors, climate control, even the window shutters. Almost everything in her apartment bent easily to her will. Lines of code spilled across the screens as her demons came online. Small, self-written programs that in this case ran silent searches through Night City's information feeds. They combed news sites, chatter on the local net, even unsecured cameras, looking for traces of Emir Scandatech, the largest corporation in Norway. Company logos, security uniforms, mentions of anything to do with her former family. Every scan also probed for ICE, intrusion countermeasures electronics, digital watchdogs that might have sniffed out her demons if she wasn't careful. Most importantly, the program was on the lookout for anyone wearing clothing made of the same unique fabric as the armored bodysuit she'd stuffed in a lockbox and hidden under her bed. Most nights ended the same, blank windows and a soft chime accompanying the words "match not found." Tonight was no different. Only then did she let out another breath, safe for another day. She hadn't always been. Sofie had once been one of the 9 children remade into corporate soldiers, assassins, and black operatives by the Emir Scandatech Corporation at the behest of its CEO, Ursa Hrafnsdottir, their mother. They were the Nihaimar, the 9 realms, each named for a world of Old Norse myth. They weren't truly siblings, of course, but they were the only family she knew. The training had been relentless. Weapons, tactics, cybernetic augmentation, every piece of chrome forced into them came with its own lesson in obedience. She remembered sterile halls, endless drills, and the cold, digital eyes of their instructor, an artificial intelligence that saw her as nothing more than another experiment in flesh and circuitry. Most of her siblings had surrendered to or readily accepted their conditioning. She hadn't. Why she alone had slipped free, Sofie still didn't know. Strength, luck, or simply a crack in the design, none of it mattered. What mattered was that she had escaped, and that meant she would always be a loose end that Ursa could not allow to dangle. Sofie set her empty cup in the sink, slipped on her shoes, and tapped the control panel next to the door. The lock clicked, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Noise rushed in the moment she stepped into the hall. The mega building was never quiet. Tenants shouting, kids running past, music bleeding through open doors, and the constant thrum of vending machines humming against the walls. The air smelled of 30 different kinds of food and incense burning somewhere down the corridor. She fell in with the crowd moving toward the atrium. The narrow hall opened into the cavernous hollow at the building's core, a space that stretched dizzyingly up through 90 floors of stacked balconies. Light bled down from neon billboards mounted across the higher tiers, advertising energy drinks, the newest cyberware, and vacations on the moon. Every 10th floor was a market deck, packed with stalls and storefronts. From where she stood, Sofie could already see the green and orange glow of the Wirehound's neon signs hanging over the nearest shops. Their enforcers stood out easily enough with green and orange markings on tactical gear, rifles slung casually at their sides, and batons clipped to their belts. They prowled in pairs, watching from balconies, leaning against railings, smoking while their eyes tracked the crowd below. Most tenants ignored them, and were ignored in turn, unless they drew too much attention. The Wirehounds weren't interested in petty squabbles. They kept order, collected dues, and made sure no one stirred up trouble. Less visible were the stray eyes. They were the ones who were in control here, answering only to the alphas at the top of the dog pile, as it were. Sofie rarely saw them, which is how they liked it. Where the rest of the enforcers thrived on being seen, the stray eyes preferred to go without. They watched from the shadows, blending with the crowds, and keeping peace within the building in a much subtler manner than the enforcers they commanded. For the most part, as long as nobody in the building started causing trouble for the hounds, they left everyone alone and acted as security. They might step in to break up fights, but mostly they kept the regular tenants out of the places that the gang had deemed employees only. It was one of these areas that Sofie was entering now. The back hallway was quieter, stripped of the noise and chaos of the atrium. Sofie nodded at the door guard, a tattooed woman with a shotgun slung from a shoulder strap. The woman gave a grunt in return, and that was all the acknowledgement either of them needed. It hadn't taken the Wirehounds long to realize she was more than just another tenant paying their slightly higher than average rent. At first, Sofie scraped by on small favors, helping an elderly neighbor recover lost files from her computer, cleaning malware out of personal systems, the kind of work that only paid a few Eurodollars, and only someone desperate for those few Eurodollars would take. Her neighbor, Jamie Birch, a techie who lived and worked a few doors down, threw her the occasional job as well. Jamie was brilliant with busted wiring and jury-rigged chrome, but didn't have much patience for the software side of things. She'd point clients in Sofie's direction whenever a system needed scrubbing instead of soldering. This was fine by Sofie. As a netrunner, software was her specialty. They got along well enough, though Jamie was odd, eccentric in ways that made her seem half feral to the uninitiated. Once, when Sofie had asked why she preferred to sleep outside her apartment like the local homeless, Jamie had just shrugged and said she liked the air better. Eventually, Jamie had passed her name to a fixer, and Sofie found herself taking contracts that carried far more risk than recovering lost photos of her neighbor's grandkids, and paid more in return. As Sofie moved further down the hall, a door behind her slid open. She turned, just enough to catch a familiar figure stepping out. Ares. He wore tactical gear similar to most of the Wirehound's enforcers, but the only instance of their colors on his clothes was a single green and orange band wrapped around the left sleeve of his bomber jacket. He was a stray eye, one of the two who oversaw her floor and the two above and below, and as such, the other hounds respected him without question. His gaze swept the corridor, quick and practiced, before landing on her. A flicker of recognition, then the small half-smile she'd come to expect from him. That smile widened when she turned the rest of the way around and Ares saw her shirt. Silent, but still smiling, he lifted the slim, rectangular device he was holding, his agent, up for her to see. Although Ares had a neuroport implanted in his skull like Sofie and most people these days, with an agent included, he still preferred to use the one he could hold in his hand. He gave it a little shake, the familiar wordless offer she'd come to recognize. Call me if you want to do something later. Usually, she did. They kept it simple, grabbing food at the market stalls, wandering the city to watch people drift through the endless churn of night city life. Sometimes they'd sit in the Hound's garage while Ares would tinker with his car and tell her about his past wandering the new United States western Badlands as a nomad, what it was like to grow up on the road with a family that was equal parts tribe and crew. Sofie liked those stories, so different to her own childhood. Once, on a rare quiet night, he'd even dragged her to a screening of an old action film from the 2020s, Bushido. Sofie hadn't told him much about her past, only confirmed that her accent was in fact Norwegian. He'd never pressed her for more, but he wasn't blind either. He'd noticed the gaps, the things she hadn't done that he took for granted. Movies, music, even simple nights out. So he helped her find those firsts, piece by piece, his quiet way of helping her catch up to the world she'd been denied. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A fast friendship built on easy conversation and small escapes. The kind Sofie had never known before. She was already in an introspective mood, and seeing him now tugged her back to the first time they met, the day he'd knocked on her door, and instead of demanding payment, asked the questions that changed everything. Living in Night City meant one was beholden to a system built to bleed the people dry. Rent, utilities, food, everything carried a price, and the job Sofie was pulling barely kept her ahead of it. Scrubbing viruses and running errands for fixers paid barely enough to scrape by, and most of her early income had vanished into building the workspace she needed to function as a netrunner. Her cyberdeck and the virtuality function of her neuroport that allowed her to visualize cyberspace meant nothing without a secure, reliable access point. Building the computer that accommodated her needs hadn't been cheap, and without it, she'd be stuck debugging her neighbors' laptops. When her first missed payment came due, she thought it would mean eviction, or worse. Fortunately, it had been Ares who had come to collect, and when she'd opened the door, he hadn't found another tenant scrambling with excuses. Instead, he saw her life laid out before him among the chaotic cables that spread across the floor. The word Netrunner might as well have been scrawled across the walls in fluorescent paint. He'd looked around as she invited him in, taking in the tangle of cables, the freshly ice-filled tub, and the expertly constructed, powerful computer sitting on the desk. Whatever he'd meant to say first never made it out. Instead of the usual questions about why she hadn't paid rent, he asked an entirely different set. Could she infiltrate a hostile data fort and get out cleanly? Could she hold her own against black ice without frying her synapses? Could she write and adapt her own programs on the fly? Sofie hadn't been sure if admitting the truth was a mistake, but Ares only nodded, weighing her answers carefully. Then he'd given her a chance, a small job for the Hounds. In essence, a test. She'd finished it in half the time she'd estimated it would take, her code tighter and cleaner than the other runners that the Hounds already employed. After that, she was treated as one of their own, and the work kept coming. She kept their systems clean, patched vulnerabilities, and reinforced the ice wrapped around the Hound's infrastructure. Sofie blinked, pulling herself back to the present. Ares was still there in the hall, waiting just long enough for her response. She lifted her hand to her ear, thumb and little finger extended. His smile widened just slightly before he tucked the agent into his jacket pocket and strode toward the atrium, his boots striking a steady rhythm on the floor. Her own footsteps joined his as she continued down the hall to her destination, the server room. The door hissed open to reveal racks of humming hardware strung with cables, lights blinking in steady patterns. At the center of it all sat Matthew, a techie a little younger than Sofie. She was 24, and he couldn't have been more than 21. He was already half swallowed by his chrome. Both arms were fully cybernetic, and compartments along the forearms were filled with tools. His hands were modular and custom-made, each finger tipped with fine instruments, soldering pick, microdriver, precision torch. He even carried spare hands with him. Every one was designed with joints in the fingers that let them fold flat against either the palm or the back, allowing them to be swapped onto either arm. Together, they kept the Hound's data fortress standing, Matthew handling the servers, Sofie the digital architecture. By rights, that made her his superior. Her work was more complex, and the stray eyes trusted her to oversee the whole system. But that wasn't how their dynamic worked. As far as either of them were concerned, she wasn't his boss. She got to tell him what to do, but not how to do it. He was bent over a circuit board when she stepped inside, muttering to himself as he carefully traced his soldering pick finger over its surface. He was so engrossed in his work that he didn't notice her until she cleared her throat. He jerked upright, the circuit board clattering to the workbench. For a second, his mechanical fingers twitched like they were going to fold themselves into another form entirely. Then he spotted her and grinned sheepishly. "Oh, hey! Didn't see you there." "Don't worry about it," she said, stepping further inside, glancing at the blinking towers that surrounded them. "Anything unusual today, Matthew?" He shook his head quickly. "Nah, nothing. The fortress is solid, stronger than ever." He paused, then leaned forward. He shook his head quickly. "Nah, nothing. The fortress is solid, stronger than ever." He paused, then leaned forward with a hopeful look. Did you get it?" Sofie poked a finger behind her ear and ejected a data shard, a portable data drive only a little larger than her fingernail, from one of the access slots built into her neuroport. Between two fingers, she held up the shard, filled to the brim with black and white samurai films from before the turn of the century. Very hard to find these days, well over 100 years after their release. Matthew plucked it from her hand like it was treasure, grinning as he lifted a small display tablet from the desk and popped the shard into the side. "Sweet! Can't wait to watch all these." A moment later, his eyes flashed blue, and Sofie's optical display reported a transfer of Eurodollars into her account. As she read the number, her eyebrow arched. "Whoa, hey! That's way more than we agreed on." "Just a bonus," Matthew said, tapping the side of his head with a chrome finger. "For being such a cool boss. Don't complain, I just dropped you 1,000 eddies." Sofie shook her head, though she couldn't keep a faint smile from tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Okay, fine." She raised her hands in surrender. "Just don't neglect your job to binge them. I doubt the alphas will accept movie marathon as an excuse if the fortress goes down." "Relax," he said, the display already shining with the opening credits of the first film. "They were eddies well spent, and I'm a great multitasker." Sofie left him to his movies, the sound of a triumphant war cry already echoing from the tablet as the server room hissed shut behind her. The atrium was louder now, the air thick with voices. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since yesterday. She cut through the flow of tenants and bypassed the shopkeepers, making her way to the elevator that would take her down to the bustling streets. By the time she made it outside, dusk was spreading across Night City. Neon had already taken over, splashing color across cracked pavement and casting long, jagged shadows between the towers. Vendors gathered in the shadow of the mega building, shouting over one another, hawking second-hand clothing, synth meat skewers, and whatever else they thought could net them a Eurobuck. Traffic growled past in a blur of headlights and exhaust, and somewhere far off, sirens wailed against the endless thrum of the city. It was a long, cross-district walk from Haywood to Watson, and Sofie debated the metro more than once before deciding that her legs would do. The city stretched on in waves around her, block after block of neon and decay, the horizon swallowed by towers too tall to see past. By the time she reached her destination, Tom's Diner, her stomach was a knot and her head was buzzing with the noise of the streets. The neon sign outside glowed with retro charm, a chrome-framed throwback to a 50s past that had never really existed. Inside, the counters gleamed with polish, the booths upholstered in red vinyl patched more times than Sofie could count. It smelled of frying grease and burnt coffee, a strangely comforting perfume. She slid into a booth near the back, grateful for the pocket of relative quiet that it offered, and ordered a plate of pancakes. The radio on the counter played loud enough to fill the room. The radio on the counter played loud enough to fill the room. The deep voice of the station's host, Maximum Mike, cutting in between tracks. I'm telling you folks, the Arasaka family doesn't age. They don't die. Why? Because they're not alive in the first place. Bloodsuckers. Vampires. How else do you explain Saburo Arasaka still pulling strings after 100 years? They hide it in plain sight. The suits, the boardrooms, it's all a front for feeding. A few patrons laughed. One muttered that Mike must be out of his mind. Sofie didn't react. She never lent any weight to stuff like that. After all, the Arasaka family being vampires would be a surprisingly reassuring thought compared to the things she knew those at the top of the corporate world were actually doing. The waitress set her plate in front of her with a smile. Sofie prodded at the food in silence, the radio droning on as her thoughts turned inward and memory pulled her elsewhere. She remembered the cold rooms, bright surgical lights, and the way the gloved hands of those she'd trusted had turned her body into something she barely recognized. She had been torn apart and rebuilt numerous times, body parts removed and replaced every few years between the ages of 3 and 11. She'd been strapped down and told it was progress, the future. She'd been too young to understand, but not too young to know it was wrong. The implants came one after another. First was the neuroport, a lattice of wetware and interface nodes buried deep in her skull. It was the groundwork, the piece that let everything else talk to her nervous system. Without it, the rest would never have taken. Ports lined the base of her neck now, access slots for shards and cables, each one a scar from the day her body stopped being whole. Then came the optics. New, metal eyes that granted her perfect vision and fed her a stream of data overlays. She could see in low light and infrared, and no longer required a headset to view the net in virtuality. Cyberspace was part of her now. Her arms had been replaced with chrome prosthetics covered in real skin, identical at a glance, save for the thin silver seams crisscrossing the surface. Her right arm concealed a cyberdeck within the forearm, a powerful computer facilitating her manipulation of the net. Hidden in her left was a monowire, a spool of superheated monomolecular thread she could unfurl as a whip or tighten into a garrote. And then there was the Sandevistan. Grafted directly to her spine, a series of metal plates and green lights ran from the nape of her neck to the lowest of her thoracic vertebrae. The speedware rewired her perception, quickening her thoughts until the world itself seemed to slow, every detail suspended in unnatural clarity. It heightened her metabolic rate as well, driving her body to seemingly impossible speeds. The first time it had triggered was during recovery, before she'd even managed to sit up in bed. Her body was still raw from the surgery, every breath shallow against the pain radiating from her back to the rest of her body. And then, without warning, the implant fired. The world collapsed into viridescent stillness. She couldn't move, couldn't even hear herself as she cried out. Her mind screamed forward as her body failed to follow, locked in weakness. Seconds stretched into hours, hours into days. For 47 hours she lay there, trapped in a timeless hell, every nerve burning under the strain of a body forced to run faster than it could sustain. When it finally released her, she had learned to fear it. Not just the speed, nor the silence, but the deeper pull beneath it all. The feeling that something vast and hungry waited at the edges of her mind, ready to sink its teeth in if she lingered too long. The sense that should she lose control of the implant again, it might never let her go. Sofie hated lingering on memories like these, so as she finished her meal and pushed the plate aside, she forced herself to leave the thoughts in the diner with her empty dish. Dwelling wouldn't change the past. Out on the street again, with the city pressing in around her, she let the noise and neon anchor her in the present. Navarro's clinic was waiting. Jamie Birch had mentioned her first. Said there was a Ripper Doc in Haywood who actually cared if your chrome worked the way it was supposed to, not just if you paid on time. Sofie had filed the name away but hadn't acted on it. A Ripper Doc poking around in her cyberware wasn't something she was going to take chances with. It wasn't until Ares had brought up the same name, Elise Navarro, the one he trusted to keep his own implants in check, that Sofie finally made the trip. If Jamie's recommendation had planted the seed, Ares' confidence had allowed it to grow, and Navarro had lived up to their recommendations from the start. The clinic was tucked between a Second Amendment gun store and a Buck-a-Slice pizza joint. Sofie pushed through the door and stepped into the darkened workshop. The space was dim, lit mostly by the glow of desk lamps and softly humming diagnostic displays. Boxes of cyberware sat stacked against the walls, some still sealed, others spilling their contents across long benches. Limbs in varying states of assembly hung from overhead racks. Arms, legs, a mismatched assortment of chrome and plastic dangling like some mechanical butcher's shop. The air smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol and machine oil. "Doc? You in here? Be right with you," a voice called from deeper inside. A moment later, the racks shifted, and Elise Navarro was peering at Sofie like a wilderness explorer parting a curtain of vines. She was deeply tanned, with dark hair pulled into a messy knot behind her head. The set of multifaceted tech goggles over her eyes gave Sofie the impression of a spider. "Well, well," Navarro said, stepping through the rack and fully into view. "If it isn't my favorite chrome-shy client. You here for a checkup, or did something finally blow?" Sofie gave a small shrug. "Checkup? Nothing's broken yet?" Navarro snorted and pushed the goggles up onto her head. "Yet," being the key word. "Don't get me wrong, kiddo. You keep your gear clean. Maintenance isn't the issue. But come on, Sofie. Half of what's inside you belongs in a museum. The only thing you've let me sell you in 2 years was a new cyberdeck. A handheld one at that. Not even to replace the one internalized in your arm." She waved Sofie toward the exam table in the corner. Navarro sat backwards on a rolling stool, arms crossed over the backrest, and wheeled over to Sofie as she laid down. "It still works, Doc." "For now. But you're running an antique chrome. And I've seen the way you operate in the net. I'm telling you, it's only a matter of time before it stops working." Navarro flicked on the lamp over the exam table, the harsh light carving shadows across her face as she leaned in. "Corps don't design this stuff to last forever. They build it so you'll come crawling back for replacements when it slows down or craps out. You're the only person I've ever met stubborn enough to try and prove them wrong." Sofie exhaled through her nose. "You say stubborn. I say careful." "Same thing in your case," Navarro smirked, tugging on a pair of gloves. "Give me your personal link. Let's take a look." She took the universal cable Sofie pulled from her left palm and plugged it into the computer next to the chair. While the diagnostics program started up, she adjusted the lamp and tilted Sofie's head to the side to expose the access ports behind her ears. Ports are clean, no corrosion, a little worn. She glanced at the screen. No errors in the software either. No surprise there. You've always kept things clean on that side. She moved down Sofie's arms, fingers brushing over the seams hidden in her real skin. She poked at each one of Sofie's fingertips with a small instrument that looked like a dentist's pick. Reflexes are sharp, though your joints are about a decade out of spec. You'd be amazed at how clunky this feels if you tried a modern replacement. Sofie gave a dry laugh. I'll take your word for it. Navarro rolled her eyes and motioned for her to flip onto her stomach. Sofie pulled her tank top up to expose her midriff, and more importantly, her back, as she did. Navarro tapped each of the metal plates along her spine as she inspected the Sandevistan. The green lights were dormant, the metal cold beneath her touch. And here it is. Whoever put it in knew what they were doing. You know, for all the ancient chrome you're lugging around, this thing might as well be fresh off the assembly line. Hell, it's in better shape than half the implants I see come through here brand new. I don't use it, Sofie said flatly. Yeah, I know. And maybe that's why it still looks brand new. Navarro sat back, pulling off her gloves with a snap. Everything else is holding together. But kiddo, you're running hardware that's nearly as old as you are. If it hiccups on you at the wrong time, don't tell me I didn't warn you. I wouldn't dare, Sofie said as she tugged her shirt back down and swung her legs off the table. But if it does hiccup, you'll be the first to know. Navarro rolled her eyes again, pushing her stool back toward her workbench. Damn right I will. 200 eddies, and I'll see you back in 2 weeks. Same as always, Sofie said as she paid and headed for the door. Back on the street, Sofie began the walk home. She passed an alley where several people huddled under cardboard and tarps, their eyes glassy with hunger or cheap drugs. Overhead, an aerodyne thundered between the towers, engines screaming. A pack of bikers roared past in vibrant leathers, their laughter jagged and sharp against the air. Sirens wailed in the distance, gunshots cracked. An explosion rolled somewhere in the city, rattling windows with its echo. This was the usual ambiance of Night City, violent and unpredictable. Sofie didn't exactly love it, but it was better. Better than the low, rhythmic hum of climate control fighting a never-ending war against encroaching cold. Better than her mother's voice issuing orders through speakers, almost never in person. Better than the unblinking gaze of Prosopon, the AI that had watched and mentored her from the moment she arrived in its domain. Better than Naustrand, the corpse shore, where Sofie had been forged in fire and blood and given the name Muspelheim, where every skill she knew, inside the net and out, had been drilled into her, where implants were forced into her body before she was ready, where she had lived for her entire childhood, a corporate pawn. It was where she'd learned the truth.